All right, Herle Burlyites, thank you for tuning in again this week. We've got a treat for you, but first I want to thank you for all the love you gave our 5th anniversary show with David Axelrod last week. He was really good to come back and do that with us, and we're so happy to have been on the air for 5 years. In that 5 years, the second most listened to show of the Herle Burly is John Webster's previous appearance on this show. So we're also joined by Ron Butler. And Ron is the founder of Butler Mortgage. Smart as a whip, very successful, very thoughtful. But Ron, if this show is a dud, it's clearly your fault.
It's all on me.
It's clearly all on you.
All on me.
John Webster is one of the innovators in the housing world, the president of Scotia Mortgage Authority, and the second most listened to guest in the 5-year history of the Herle Burly. Who did he lose to? Not Robbie Robertson, not Paul Martin, not Brian Mulrooney. Seamus O'Regan.
What?
Seamus O'Regan, number 1 all-time listened to show. You're number 2. Hey, this is good. This is awesome.
I would have rather finished second to Muldoon than Seamus.
We are going to talk about all things housing today with these two gentlemen. We're going to talk about where the market was before the Bank of Canada intervened, where it is now, what buyers and sellers should be thinking about, and what the government should be thinking about on all this stuff. And there aren't two better people to have that conversation with. So thank you two very, very much for joining me. Talk about this today. I just want to say before we start, we're going to be going back and forth between public policy considerations and individual consumer considerations. So I'll try to be clear about what we're talking about. But I'd like to start by asking both of you, because everybody's talking about this, but nobody really seems to have common reference points. You've both been leaders in this business for over a quarter century. What's different now than was the case 25 years ago? What are the biggest changes you've observed in this industry over time? John, do you want to start us off?
Well, can I digress just to start out with? A couple of weeks ago, I told you I was at Sarah Savard's charity tournament at La Mirage. And your good friend Ken Dryden was there presenting his new book on the series, the 50th anniversary of the 72 series. And this is really only relevant to you. As he walked up to me, he went, "Frick or frack?"
Are you frick or are you frack?
Well, he's not sure either. So I told him you would be welcoming him to discuss his book on your podcast, which he was very excited about. And I said, now let me go first so I can build an audience for you, Ken.
I'm just glad Savard didn't have anything terrible to say about me again.
Well, he did, but I didn't want to share that with you at the outset. I was keeping that in my pocket. He said his usually charitable things about how you run campaigns into the ground, that sort of stuff.
No, exactly. His son might be the prime minister today had I done a better job.
For you. Yeah.
That's how it goes. All right, maybe I'll flip over to you, Ron. Okay, so you both have over 25 years experience in this industry, and it's changed a lot. How has it changed, Ron? What have you noticed over time?
Well, the most incredibly obvious thing that's changed is the size of the mortgages. That's what's changed. I mean, we've got average balance mortgage in the GTA, new origination stuff mortgages that were taken out in 2000, 2001, early 2022. 21, 22. These are like $600,000 average mortgages, which is a lot different than the previous 23 years we've been doing this. Big difference.
Right. And that has thrown out of whack completely the income to mortgage ratios that people traditionally had in their head, right?
About as far out of whack as you can get before it dissolves, yeah.
Right. John, what about you? What's the biggest thing you've seen happen?
I'm not sure this would be no surprise to Ron that I agree with him. The mortgage balances are up because the value of the homes are up, and so there's some inflation on that basis. I don't think that it's had that profound an impact on debt service. I mean, there used to be this notional rule of thumb, buy a house 3 times your income. Obviously, that's been stretched. That multiplier has gone up, particularly in the major urban markets, Toronto, Vancouver, etc. But no, I'd say that, David, the most profound difference, and I've been in the business more than 30 some years, so I go back to the land of the quill. My reaction would be technology's been the biggest change. the impact of technology automations had on the business, on the ease of customer service, the ability to service people like Ron, because Ron's my customer, but his customers are also our customers. And I think technology has been, for me, the driving factor.
And that's been a change. That's been a change that is helpful in, say, being a banker. How does it translate down to an ordinary home buyer or home seller? What's the difference to them?
It's incredibly the ease of convenience that technology brings to the home buying journey, from being able to do your search literally in front of your laptop or on your handheld or even on your mobile device. All of these services have been expanded. Players in the industry have all updated your ability as a consumer to access these points. So whether you're searching the property, looking for evaluation, getting other information that you need when you're setting out to buy your house, that's really at your fingertips. And from a lender's perspective, that's a continuous improvement program for us to continue to make sure that you as a customer can access this automatically. And, in the bank's context, it's very tough to get a lot of legacy systems. But I would argue that in Ron's business, as one of our major origination channels, the broker space, because we deal with our own sales force that does the same. We have the retail network. We also have a virtual program where you can enter and fulfill end-to-end simply by getting on the Scotia eHome. So all of these things are complementary. But I'd say that what's assisted in my argument, I would make that's what's assisted the broker business and Ron's business from day one was they were the first really to be automated in order to send their deals in through a pipeline and be able to work when borrowers were looking at purchasing properties on evenings and weekends. And they were really the first channel to do that. And that's just continued to be constantly enhanced. So I would say technology has changed the game to the benefit of the consumer, more transparency, much, much faster. And it also, from a lender's perspective, the biggest challenge is scalability. That you have to have a really big capacity to be in this business. And technology allows you to scale, regardless of who you are.
Interesting. Okay. So the affordability of housing is, I did a poll a month or so ago, and I was asking people what was most concerning to them in the country. Inflation, number one answer, cost of living. Second answer, the healthcare system. Third answer, the affordability of housing for people. Third biggest concern in the country. Before we talk about what's happened since the Bank of Canada intervened this summer with interest rates, in the spring, when housing prices and housing sales were hitting these records, and despite the fact that prices were going up and up and up, people were still buying and buying and buying. What were the core drivers of that? It's completely out of whack with incomes. It's completely out of whack with the rest of the world. What was driving that growth in house prices in Canada?
Well, the simple answer is hyper low interest rates. Really, really low interest rates. And we're talking about, and it's a build. It just doesn't start in January of 2022. It was a build throughout 2021, where you had a variable rate as low as 1.25, as low as often at 1.4. And even though all of those mortgages were stress tested, as they should have been, and this is the big thing that will probably come out to save the Canadian consumer, is the stress test, even though people made fun of it for the first 5 years. The reality is that the incredibly low cost of capital combined with a narrative of real estate only going up. And it did. We encountered a once in a 100-year plague combined with a catastrophic economic contraction. And at the end of the first 3 months of it, real estate just started going up again. It was essentially the immortal asset class that just kept on going, fed by ultra low interest rates, and then a narrative that you just better get a house before they're all gone. And that's what took us to the first quarter of 2022.
I think
built on
that
a
is,
sense that yeah, go ahead, John.
no, I think that is I'm glad Ron characterized that as a simple response. So I'll try to give the more complex, nuanced answers.
That's why you're here, John. That's why you're here.
The reality is there was a lot of pent-up demand going into the pandemic, and ultra-low interest rates certainly were a catalyst, David, for not only impacting affordability and rising house prices, but it's household formation. It's the law of supply and demand. And in this country, immigration drives the largest group of new households being formed every year. Even within the pandemic, when people could not travel, so we weren't admitting people from other countries, we basically allowed people that were already here to successfully become landed immigrants, and they were a big part of that push. So, we've more than doubled, tripled those totals. This year, it'll be 500,000. That puts an incredible amount of pressure on the supply. So we have very, very limited supply and lots of issues around increasing supply, whether it's the municipal approval, whether it is supply chain issues, whether it's escalating costs of construction for new dwellings. All of those things happen. But in the pandemic, what really happened was that people were able to work remotely. They could reconsider where they live. Like, you don't need to be in downtown Toronto to do your job. People went further afield. So they also were cooped up and they wanted to be outside. There was a big, big increase, not only in single family dwellings that were purchased in more remote drive-to communities, but as you would know, recreational properties went through the roof, right? So there's that group of new Canadians that drive household formation, and we're at record levels. Like, we admit twice what Australia does, which has a very dynamic housing market, and a lot of people compare it to ours. And then in addition, we have a big, big cohort of millennials that want to become first-time home buyers. There was a survey released by Royal LePage last week, and it indicated that still the overwhelming majority of millennials, notwithstanding the affordability issues and rising interest rates, still plan to buy a home. So the dream of home ownership is really baked in terms of the Canadian social fabric, and we are expanding our population rapidly, and they tend to congregate in the major urban centers like Toronto, like Vancouver, that are already stressed in terms of being able to provide supply. So even with rates rising, I would argue as you look out to 23, demand will continue for the next decade or so to overwhelm supply, which means affordability is not going to get much easier anytime soon. And if you want to own a home, you're going to have to pay up to get it. Now, I find it passing strange for Ron to argue about sort of mortgage inflation, because he gets paid on a percentage of dollars out the door. So he can do less units and get more money from people like me. And that's why he's in Hawaii on a lender-sponsored trip, and you and I are here sweltering after Labor Day in Toronto.
Hey, Ron, what drives the consumer mindset? Is it the desire to own your own home in some intangible way? Or is it that people think, regardless of the price, it's still the best investment I can make? Like, why are people still buying these things?
Look, John and I fight, but the truth is he's the great synthesizer of these ideas, and he's absolutely correct. I mean, this huge influx of new Canadians, which, by the way, is the best possible thing for our country. We have to support it. And the reality is there is a cultural bias amongst the majority of these newcomers to Canada to own property. Hell, in the places they're coming from, they didn't always have an opportunity to own any property. So the idea when they get here that this is the apex goal is real. And that's not going away. Those people are going to keep coming. We need them. We absolutely need them. You got a country with an ultra low birth rate. You got to keep bringing people in. People are going to wander around Japan and see nothing but empty towns in 20 years. There'll only be people in the cities because their birth rate's fallen off a cliff. So yes, it's true. We have to have, we probably need a better mix of housing. We're building way too many 438 square foot condominium towers in Toronto. We need to address the needs of families and people who want to have family formation. You know, it's a damn shame to think that you're building a lot of product just for people you can only fit one person into it. which I guess is okay for that one person, but it's not the product that most of the new Canadians are looking for. We have to address those issues. Supply is real. And yes, has it been a great investment? Absolutely. I mean, if you compare year 2000 purchase to today, those people have done extraordinarily well. And that's the combined reasoning behind the great growth of housing in Canada.
Yeah, and Ron, I think the immigration is not only necessary, it's a good thing, but it has to be matched by all levels of government taking a much sharper approach to increasing supply, whether that's the approval process or making sure there are skilled trades or any of those barriers. But I think Ron and I have a common experience. Our borrowers, new Canadians, within 2 years when they get here, David, they want to own a home, and they'll put 5 people on title, and they'll have the extended family living there, and that is seen as a measure of your success as a new Canadian, the pride of home ownership. It wasn't attainable previously in the country of their origin, and they come here and it's a big deal. Millennials, though, and I feel for them, affordability is a real issue. You know, they have to stretch right now for an increased down payment. They've got to have much higher income thresholds to qualify for debt service. These are real challenges. I think that Ron is being very generous to our friend Peter Rutledge at OSFI in terms of the qualifying rate. He's a Herle Burlyite, so we have a shout out to Peter. He'll be disappointed to know that his audience was smaller than mine, but he'll get over it. The reality is that I think the qualifying rate was a good thing in terms of providing an interest rate cushion. But currently, the rule is for all of your listeners that we have to qualify those borrowers at the contract rate plus 2%. So when the 5-year rate in another several months gets to 550 or above, that means we're qualifying them now at 7 when they're only paying 5, and we'll have to qualify them at 7.5. So hopefully by year end, OSFI will say, that the necessity for that interest rate cushion no longer exists. But that's hurting the market right now. The fact that we have to underwrite at that elevated level beyond the growth in the interest rates, because it is profound. People were paying less than 1% and sometimes on the variable, and now they're looking at it being 5 times greater. So it's
John,
that's not going to change.
You'd have to explain that to me, why you'd want to get rid of that thing, though, because we've had this growth in interest rates, 3 percentage points since the start of the year, and I'm seeing no reporting of massive defaults on mortgages out there. No. Despite those increases. So that makes me think that the stress test is genius. And I don't think the Bank of Canada is done yet raising interest rates. No, they're not done raising interest rates, but it's not genius. In terms of you paying a contract rate at 5.5, I would argue that the necessity is to underwrite you at that rate and not at 7.5. That knocks out a lot of potential purchasers if you look at those income thresholds. So I don't give that rate that much credit. We have very, very well-run, prudent lenders, and I don't, say that that's exclusive to the banks by any means. Underwriting in Canada, people know what they're doing. Borrowers are responsible. This idea that save us from ourselves, I'm not celebrating that. I don't believe that that's as big a factor. There is no reason, in my view, to maintain the qualifying rate beyond this calendar year end. And that would be my recommendation to our friend Peter. Because it's more important to make it more affordable than it is to be prudentially safe? Well, there's no reason for that interest rate cushion anymore, particularly if you believe inflation's peaked and they get to a Bank of Canada neutral rate. So the algorithm that they developed in the ultra low interest rate environment is not applicable now. And he would say that to you if you asked him that question. I believe he would. He'd say, no, it's no longer applicable. So I'm glad everyone can break their arm patting themselves on the bank that, they save lenders from themselves. That's not my experience. Let's remember 2 things. The majority of homeowners in Canada don't have a mortgage, and the ones that do are very prudently underwritten in terms of their debt service and their ability to afford it. And Canadians overwhelmingly want to pay down their mortgage. The issue is not people extending debt in this country. The issue is they accelerate their amortization schedule. They see it as a good thing
to build equity in their homes. And Canadians have been very successful at doing that. So I think that should be the narrative that we discuss.
Okay.
I think to John's point, we had 100 years where we didn't need a stress test because we had rates that were upwards of 5%. So literally, there was never an issue renewing a mortgage. There was a short window of time between late 70s and mid 80s when there was an extreme inflation crisis and you had enormously high interest rates, and people still managed. I mean, there was not massive default in this country when interest rates were 19%. People found a way. So the need for the stress test, when historically on fixed rate mortgages, there was a smooth renewal process. Now that we've got rates up from 1.5% to 1.99%, 2.49%, now that rates are up in the fives, and with this change today, every variable rate starts with a 4 in front of it. You've got a reality that it's more like it was in the past when we survived without a stress test for 100 years.
Herle Burlyites, our world tour continues. Last couple of weeks, we spent some quality time in South Korea. This week, a whirlwind spin around all G7 countries. We take it on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. And in case you've forgotten, this is a tour of international best practices, countries who are using evidence to create policy around how they manage and distribute their spectrum. Spectrum is what makes wireless connectivity work. So how does Canadian policy stack up when it comes to connecting our rural and remote communities? Well, Canada has had a long-standing commitment to a thing called set-asides. Basically, our government sets aside some spectrum at greatly subsidized rates to incentivize regional operators to invest and drive connectivity in rural markets. That's the theory. But here's the thing. There's no evidence to suggest it's working. Like, none. On the average, only 20% of the rural spectrum held by regional carriers has even been deployed, which means entire communities are going without high-speed wireless. And what of our friends in the G7? No other G7 nation used set-asides in their mid-band spectrum allocation. You can throw Australia and South Korea in there too. They didn't use them either. Despite all this, Canada is still considering set-asides for our upcoming millimeter wave auction, just like we considered them for our second of 2 mid-band spectrum auctions. In that case, the government smartly decided to go with the far more common and successful CAPS system, based on the reams of evidence from international best practices that it's a far more successful competitive measure. CAPS are on the table for the millimeter wave auction too. Herle Burlyites, I've talked about it here before. TELUS believes every rural and remote community should have access to high-speed connectivity, on par with our urban centers. Government social policy says they believe that too. So it's critical that the same evidence-based policy making is applied to get us there. More next week from Germany, France, the UK, and Sweden. Okay, but I'm really struggling to understand this. So interest rates were at 0.25 and lending rates for mortgages were what at that point?
Well, the Bank of Canada qualifying rate has gone up twice, so it went from 4.79 to 5.25. So you had to qualify at that rate, whether interest rates were 1% or not.
Right. So they had it. Interest rates were super low, and OSFI said rates may go up at some point. We need to know that people could still afford their homes if the rates went up. So we're going to make them qualify 2 percentage points higher than what rates currently are.
The lower of the qualifying rate, 5.25, say, or the contract rate plus 2. So right. Now the qualifying rate's irrelevant. We're underwriting at contract rate plus 2. So in the 5-year term, it's 7%. So what Ron and I are saying is, if inflation's under control, what is the necessity to preserve this artificially high rate? The OSFI didn't intend for us to be underwriting people on a 5% 5-year mortgage at 7%. That was never their intention. I'm not saying that the qualifying rate wasn't a good idea in that ultra low interest rate. It was. It provided people with an interest rate cushion. What's happening out there today is, as the delta, the gap between varying variable rates and 5-year fixed closes, more people are in a dilemma because they've been hanging on to that variable, hoping to preserve that lower interest rate. Whereas if they'd locked into a 5-year previously, they would have that certainty of the low interest rate and that payment for the next 5 years. So typically consumers, in my experience, and I think Ron would share this, they always react after the change has been made, right? So there's a lot of people out there that are going to have to convert or are going to look at converting their variable, or they say, well, I missed the boat, I'll just play the variable game over the next couple of years. So if you're a consumer, you're a first timer, you go to someone like Ron, he's going to give you advice that you want stability, you want to know what your payment is, you want to understand what are the other financial perils of owning your first home, whether that's a leaky roof or a broken furnace, whatever. And you're going to say, look, it's better for you to know 5 years of these payments every month or bi-weekly. And that's typically, you have to tailor the response to the individual consumer circumstances. For someone who's more affluent and can afford to take on that risk, then variable may be the appropriate way to go. But interest rates have been at a setting that Ron and I never saw in our lifetimes in terms of the low end. And obviously, consumers became conditioned to thinking that 2% was too much money, then 3% was too expensive. Now, Ron probably had a mortgage in those times where it was 19%. And as he said, secured debt never defaults. The last thing people will ever give up is their home. If you talk to your old friends at the mortgage default insurers, they will tell you they never exit a person. They work with them because people will find a way to keep paying. They'll pay for their house beyond anything else. The only other very difficult proposition for consumers under stress is they'll pay any interest rate for a car because they have to have a car to work, to pursue all of their household activities. So they currently, for those that don't qualify, pay really, really high rates, right? In the housing market, the last thing someone wants to do is give up their home.
Yeah, we have to reference what we could only call aberrant interest rates. When you've got a variable rate that's at 1% at one point in time and a fixed rate at 1.6, it's wise for a regulator to say, hey, I don't think this is normal in any way. Therefore, we have to have a stress test. When we're looking at all the rates going into the 4s and 5s and potentially, possibly slightly higher, we are now into a very normal range of interest rates, which make the stress test much less necessary. That said, I think the regulator will continue to pat themselves on the back, sorry, Peter, and say that they saved the world with the stress test. I think that's a pretty obvious fact. But to your point, David, about millennials and John's point of how they're feeling about this, I have millennials who are my employees. And my overwhelming sense from talking to them is a lot of frustration with a tinge of anger that this is their situation.
Is this about housing affordability or working for you?
It's a bit of both. It's a bit of both. I can't afford to pay Scotiabank wages, but there's no question that when you talk to millennials in this country, you talk to a 32-year-old in this country who wants to buy a home, there's no question about the frustration of the situation. They look at things like, well, maybe these higher interest rates are going to bring down prices. Oh, sweet Jesus, the payments are going up too. So I actually have virtually no relief from this.
Housing's less affordable now than when the Bank of Canada started its interest rate ramp up, right? Despite the fact that prices have come down a little bit.
Pretty neutral. We'll call it neutral.
We're still at a level, house price appreciation is still higher than the pre-pandemic, and I don't see that changing. There'll be a correction. I think lenders and responsible people welcome that correction in the housing market. The ultra low interest rates, along with what we discussed about the pandemic, created a lot of silly scenarios, right? With these multiple bids and no protection. And I'm glad to see that go away. I wish there was more transparency in that process. I think that realtors are doing borrowers a disservice by playing those kinds of games, like deliberately pricing it way below what the market is to get multiple offers and create these bidding wars. I think there's a more balanced market now, and by that I mean, you end up in territory where there are more sellers than buyers, and so it helps manage the demand. But the reality is household formation, David, will continue to drive demand. And I don't think when I look at anyone that I spoke to, including yourself, like 20 years ago, if they said, oh, I bought this place, that anybody regrets it. They'll tell you whether it forms a significant part of their equity for retirement or their golden years, or whether it is just to give them some comfort that they have that as a safety net. You know, real estate is a long cycle. And you have to be in it for the long cycle. When you sign up for a mortgage, you get a 25-year, for example, amortization schedule. It says you're going to repay all that principal and interest 25 years. A lot of people, as I mentioned, will accelerate that amortization and want to pay it off in 15. Some have to extend it, would like it to be out 30 to bring the payments down, give them more opportunity. But the reality of the business, if you look back since it's being measured, a bigger risk is in the mortgage business that people pay off too quickly and too soon, and you have too much churn because you're matching deposits with these assets, so liabilities and assets. So it's important to put that all into some kind of financial and economic context. But millennials are frustrated. But having said that, you need to have an expectation reset. Just because you grew up in Leaside doesn't mean you're entitled now to own a home in Leaside, which may be beyond your reach because that's part of the Manhattanization effect in Toronto, for example. So people have to adjust those standards and say they're not realistic in the current context of our times. And it is unfair because, you know, a lot of people are able to access their down payment by going to the bank of mom and dad, but not everyone has that. So we have, I think, one of the best first-time buyers program that CMHC stood up that should be celebrated as a model for the rest of the world. But instead it gets attacked by every international regulator as being too overly stimulative housing, despite the fact that, you know, our good friend, the outgoing CEO, made a meal out of saying how irresponsible they had been. But there are no defaults in the CMB that supports that program. There is no default in CMHC's portfolio. It's a success story. But like all Canadians, we're too embarrassed to trumpet what we've done well. We'd rather say, no, if our market has had that much stability, we must have had a mistake and there's a big crater coming up. It's just not true. It's not borne out by the facts. We have a stable mortgage lending system in Canada. We have a very volatile housing issue, which is driven by continued demand. And there are steps that all levels of government could be more actively engaged in to increase supply. And I think you see it in the electoral surveys. All of a sudden, housing creeps up there. You never saw that in your lifetime of polling. But
No.
Now it is top of the mind awareness.
So, Ron, when John was on the show last time, he told me that there was an increasing number of people that were getting multiple co-signers on their
Correct.
mortgage application. Usually parents, I presume.
Correct.
Yes.
Right. How many of those parents are on the hook right now?
Well, it's a brief aberrant time. If we talk about,
Well, I'm one of them.
Yeah, you're one of them. Yeah, you're one of them. Although even though one of these sons is a mortgage broker, one of the sons is a mortgage broker, so he should be able to get himself a good deal. But the reality is that it's an aberrant effect that was very, very big in the last 2 years. It's probably the highest number of multiple applicants on mortgages in the last 24 months. Slowed down now, obviously, but it was the most we've ever seen. Multiple applicants on the same mortgage.
So, Ron,
and now that the monthly payments have gone up, are these people having to belly up some cash?
The kids make the payments. Parents don't make the payments. Parents don't make the payments because John wouldn't support that payment one dime. Okay, that's reality. That kid's gonna come up with the money. All right.
Right. Ron, let me ask you. Could I ask you what you're seeing in this environment? Are you seeing more marginal credits because of the stress of the higher rates? People stretching? Are you seeing, people attempting to inflate their income or play games more than normal?
Well, the reality is in the Twitterverse, they talk about fraudulent income documents all the time. And I fight that constantly because yours and my experience in the mortgage business is it's extremely isolated. It's extremely, it's not anywhere near what people think it is. and it is very much community-based. And the reality is it's not impactful on the mortgage space in Canada, but it's something people love to talk about. People always love to talk about some bad actors in the system. But no, the reality of the last 3 months has been that there's actually some first-time home buyers getting into the market at these lower prices, somewhat under control prices. And there has been, regrettably, some borrowers driven to the edges of alternative lending when they found themselves in a position that they had to close and it wasn't working out well for them. So we've had some experience of that. But the reality is there's just a hell of a lot less sales. This was a 26-year low in July of units sold in the TREB system. TREB system, Toronto board, is the biggest real estate board in Canada. And July was a 26-year low. That's reality.
So our sponsor, CN, has a plan. The railway published it just a few weeks ago in accordance with Canadian law. It's a fairly complex plan, runs about 43 pages. It's stuffed with forecasts and statistics and analysis of shipping flows and supply chains. But basically, it says this: Western Canada's grain crop is returning to normal levels after last year's drought. And thanks to the billions of dollars CN has spent in recent years expanding and refurbishing its fleet of locomotives and hopper cars, upgrading tracks and bridges and crossings, recruiting new railroaders, the railway is ready and able to move all that grain to market. That obviously will be a comfort to Canada's grain farmers and shippers. To say they had a bad time of it last year is to understate matters. A freakish confluence of extreme weather, the pandemic, and a series of natural catastrophes piled on top of the drought, disrupting the supply chain and triggering costly delays. CN's grain plan matters. Rail is far more efficient and powerful than any other form of freight transportation. 1 ton of cargo moves 4 times farther by train than by truck on the same amount of fuel. One 300-container train replaces 300 trucks. Grain is crucial to our economy, and railways are crucial to grain. CN takes its responsibility to grain farmers and shippers very seriously indeed. CN is committed to helping power Canadian agriculture, and that means getting grain to market. This year, CN reckons it will move about 27 million tons from the prairies to customers in Canada and the US and to seaports for shipment overseas. If the crop turns out to be bigger than that, CN will be ready. And it will happen smoothly if all the other links in the supply chain communicate and work in harmony. It's time to get to work. I want to talk about a couple things that maybe seem to be less legitimate drivers of prices in the country. Let's start with foreign money. What is the truth about this? I mean, I hear different things from different governments, and sometimes they put in things like foreign buyers taxes, and other people criticize those things and say it's marginal. What is the impact? Is there a lot of foreign money coming in, and what is that doing to the market for Canadians who want to buy a home?
John?
Well, I'm glad you raised that, David. I'm always uncomfortable with demonizing one group or another. And I think that the notion that there was a significant amount of foreign buyers was overstated. Now, there are communities, pockets of activity that would be representative of a lot of foreign investment in Vancouver in particular, somewhat in Toronto, somewhat less in Montreal. So there were some isolated pockets that I would describe, but to the market, it would be less than 5%. It's like everyone needs a boogeyman, right? If it's not foreign borrowers, it's investors. Well, hello, investors provide a lot of the rental stock. Look what's happened as the market slowed down, investors are out because no one can afford a negative carry and want to reach into their pockets to cover it every month. Then rents have all gone up. So, we demonize investors a little bit, but they were providing rental stock, particularly where we needed it in the urban centers. Those things are all, in my view, over-torqued. They are not responsible. They're somewhat material. They need to be addressed, but the data sources were very uneven. Like, they were scanning condominium buildings for surnames. Like, to me, there's always a little bit of racial overtones in that I'm personally uncomfortable with. But I get that people want to say that it's somebody else's fault. The fault is our own, that we haven't built enough dwellings for our expanding population to live in. And we haven't made the rules simple enough. And we haven't made that a priority. Look, NIMBYism is a fact. Look at all those councillors in Toronto. When you tell them that we need to intensify, increase density, they're the first ones that fight any change. They should be leading the change to allow for more. But municipal actors wanted to, it goes back to local politics, David, and it's challenging. Now the province in Ontario and BC, they're becoming much more active, and some of the other jurisdictions. The feds, in my view, have to use what leverage they have, whether it's infrastructure money or something, to drag the province and the municipalities along. But land use planning in most of the provinces has been in need of an overhaul, and none of them have updated their legislation in over a quarter of a century. And then the other part is you can't build this many places if you don't have skilled trades. So we haven't done a very good job domestically of providing people with those skill sets, and we haven't incented enough people to leave other jurisdictions and come here. These are complex problems. There are solutions. We just can't move fast enough to address the affordability issue. Until we do, it will continue to be an issue. Having said that, people will continue to want to buy a home. Millennials will continue to find a way. The great thing about our lending system is there is a lender out there that will fit you. If you don't qualify for me, Ron can find you somebody else. Maybe somebody else that takes them on a nicer trip than I do. I'm finding out about loyalty as we do this broadcast.
Ron.
All right.
John was pretty dismissive. John raised the investment issue and was pretty dismissive about it. But I got to say, I did a housing panel on this show some months ago, and they all talked to me about it as a real issue. The financialization, as Adam Vaughan calls it, of the real estate market. And Kevin Carmichael from the Financial Post was also talking about it to me a couple of weeks ago, about how, from a public policy perspective, we've got too much money going into real estate as an investment and not enough into technology or things that might improve our economy down the road. It's kind of a dead investment. So, I mean, that seems to me to make sense from both angles. Both from a public policy perspective, we should have people investing in growth things rather than in real estate. And from a citizen's perspective, it's one thing if I have to compete against my neighbors for a house. It's another thing if I'm competing against big investment vehicles for things. And I read a stat the other day that over half of the condos in Vancouver are owned by people who have no intention of living in them.
Yeah, in many cases, they're held by opaque corporations. You're quite right. Well, I loved that pod with Kevin Carmichael. It was a great point that was raised. Like, let's look at it this way. When your 14-year-old goes to career day at school, do you want her to put up her hand and say, hey, my plan is to be a house flipper, just like mom. That's my future. Okay, that's not going to help Canadian productivity. It's not going to provide jobs per se, except in those skilled trades. But it's a point we have to address in this country, that there is some impact of foreign money. To John's point, it's never as much as people think it is. But regrettably, it's the tip of the spear. If you don't really care what price you're paying per se, because it's more important for you to get the money out of the country you're coming from and into this country, then price is not as big a factor, and it can lead to excessive price growth. Now, the NIMBYism, absolutely a killer. I mean, when you look at the crazy land use fights that you see in the city of Toronto and Vancouver, by the way, a lot of people don't realize Vancouver, the city that's so sought after, so beautiful, so expensive, has the lowest property taxes of any city in North America. Like, it's absolutely crazy. Next on the agenda is with low property taxes in the city of Toronto as well. And here's the really crazy part. They don't tax the people who are already in the homes. They keep those property taxes very low, but they pour $140,000, $180,000 worth of levies, fees, development costs, planning charges onto every new unit that's built in Toronto. So what the hell sense does that make, that you're going to force the cost off the people who are comfortably settled in their homes by providing them super low property taxes, and then jam the people who want to buy a home to live in when their family is formed? This is a crazy concept that the feds have to get involved at a certain point. John talked about it the last time he was on the pod. There needs to be some kind of meeting. The feds can use revenue tools to convince the provinces and convince municipalities they've gone down a wrong path. And yet crickets, we got crickets out of Ottawa on this subject right now. And as much as the current government thinks that this ratcheting of interest rates will calm the housing affordability situation, it'll just come back. It will just come back, as it always does. If you don't address these critical issues of urban planning, land release, development towards new single-family homes or townhouses, or just not the 438 square foot condo, that's really the units that are being built in Toronto today and in some other communities. If you don't address these key land use issues and this weird disparity of who you're charging to develop, you're charging people who want to buy a home $180,000, and you got the lowest property tax in North America in Vancouver. It's very hard to square that circle.
No, those are all legitimate points. And if I own Mattamy Homes, why would I invest in 1,000 units in Ontario that's going to take me 5+ years to even get off the ground? I can have them finished and built in Austin, Texas. So if you want capital to work in the housing market, it has to be more streamlined. I would say on the, you said I dismissed the investment. There is no large U.S. hedge fund up here buying single-family dwellings. The context of that in the United States, David, came out of the housing crisis, where there were, in the desert states in particular, literally millions of homes that needed someone to live in, and they were abandoned. And we're not going to go back and revisit the differences between the U.S. and Canadian lending market, but there was an opportunity there, and those large investors provided rental stock and single-family homes. That opportunity doesn't exist in Canada. And once again, I repeat, in my own condo portfolio, in terms of investors, it's relatively small. It's not the number that Ron says. And they're providing effective rental stock, and people don't want to give up on that investment. And I think given the shortage of rental stock and that nothing new gets built in terms of rental purpose-built buildings, it was all condos. So individual investors, from my point of view, have helped provide housing, rental housing where it's needed. They're all related: affordable, rental, home ownership. There's one big housing market. What I think is even more disturbing is to see that my former Liberal co-chair is hanging out with people from the Financial Post. It was hard enough for me to accept Jenny Bird. Now I hear that you are being dragged away from your instincts and your values. Shame on
I would suspect that Kevin Carmichael had to have pictures of Godfrey. I don't know how else he's kept, because he's not a typical National Poster. He's quite a bit more thoughtful. We'll be back in a minute after a message from our sponsor, Google.
Did the Jays dig the inning?
Google products are designed to help you find relevant local news. Learn how Google supports news in Canada at g.co/news in Canada.
How will inflation affect my kids?
Google products are designed to prioritize quality information so you can find news you can trust. Learn how Google supports news in Canada at g.co/news in Canada.
Hey, is the flight from urban centers to the suburbs and small communities that we were seeing in the pandemic still on? The drive till you qualify phenomenon?
Not so much now.
That's quieted quite a bit.
Yeah, most of the markets that had the most rapid increases in selling prices are the ones that have had the biggest declines, which only makes sense. So, that amount of people seeking further afield and driving up that limited supply, and also in recreational property, as there was nowhere to travel and people wanted to buy a place like that. Those values have already come off. Like Ron mentioned, Treb's pretty stable when you compare it to some of those outlying markets that really had that big push up. Like cottage country was up 30, 40, 50%, right? Now that's come down 20, 30%, but that only makes sense. Those numbers weren't supported by the market.
Yeah, you don't want to be buying a 2,500 square foot detached in Uxbridge or Chilliwack for $1.6 million and think that that's going to work out well financially. I mean, that was strictly a function of a the aberration of the COVID aftermath. And as John said, they have taken the biggest retraction. I mean, those far out exurbs where bidding wars took place and very strange prices were paid are taking the big retraction now. The reality is, although unit sales have slowed in Treb, there has not been a really impactful reduction of pricing, particularly in central Toronto and other key neighborhoods or in central Vancouver. Slowing down of unit sales, but not a particularly big drop in prices. On the exurbs, the small towns, people who bought in Peterborough thinking that they were going to, retain their job and nobody was going to ever ask them back to the office, or Mission BC and, I'll be out here forever. They may get a bit of a surprise. And unfortunately, that decision may not turn out well for those folks.
And to add to that, in terms of lifestyle, a lot of people are unrealistic about living rural that have been in an urban setting, right? So, that's an adjustment. And so you'll see some reversion to the mean. But, those were really not outliers, but it was a force of, as Ron mentioned, a 1 in 100 year pandemic that drove a lot of that behavior. And while it's slowly returning, there are still, in my view, there will be hybrid working. There will be people that are able to continue to work remotely. A large part of my successful mortgage force has always been remote, and it hasn't disadvantaged them. It does present some challenges in terms of management from time to time, that you'd like to be, you'd like to be something besides virtual. That's been challenging for, I think, all businesses, but it is manageable. So I don't think we'll be right back to pre-pandemic ways in terms of work-life and work-life balances and imbalances, but there will be more of a return to the mean. We're not overbuilt in any sector. Look at industrial prices, they're way up. Even with offices being empty, they're still adding more commercial feet. Look at the rebound of bricks and mortar retail. Even though, Amazon is still knocking it out of the park in terms of growth in sales, it's not at the level that it was. So I think things will be fairly optimistic for real estate across all of the different sectors as we move forward.
Ron, you would have been dealing with, over the last number of years, people who, we're talking about how much people want to buy houses and own houses. You would have been dealing with people who didn't qualify for a bank mortgage. John referenced earlier that most people don't have mortgages. Some of that, I presume, is because they paid it off. Some people might be.
Some of them are farms outside of Regina too, but they're but there's a bit of that. But yeah, look, it's simply true. There's a good chunk of properties, residential properties in Canada with no mortgages.
Right, but the people who couldn't get a bank mortgage, I've talked to you in the past. They were going elsewhere to get money. They were finding a way to buy the house anyway. Where did they get that money? And are those people vulnerable now? The people that don't have, like John's business is regulated through the wazoo, and there's mortgage default insurance and all this stuff. But then people couldn't qualify in that world, and they went to a darker place to get money. And what happened to them then?
Well, it's not necessarily, we can't, because I send customers there. I don't want to call it dark. I don't want to call it like that. I don't want to call it the Temple of Doom over there at the alternative lenders. I got to avoid that. But the reality is that it's still a small segment of home buyers. It's a small segment. Now it's bigger in the metropolitan centers. There's more of this alternative lending in the big metropolitan centers. That's the fact. They're a bigger percentage of the business. But yes, there are lenders that don't have the same level of scrutiny or the same level of care. They use rational underwriting approach, but they are focused on the equity in the property. And those alternative lenders, it is a problem for some of those folks, because here's what happened to those rates. They're almost all one-year terms from those lenders. And those rates have gone from 2.99 to 7.09 in 12 months. And those folks, and again, they're not a huge number of them in the totality of the whole banking industry in this country. It's still a small percentage. But we just got to talk facts. That's human tragedy when you go from 2.99 to 7.09. I mean, that's an almost unmanageable scenario.
Yeah, but at the same time, Ron, those places, in my experience, also provide rehab credit for borrowers. They're there for a year, they pay a premium, they reestablish their credit rating, and then they transfer into another institution. So they do provide a service, not in all cases,
Sure.
but in the majority of them, in my experience. And I think most of those mix and others are well run with good underwriters. That I've looked at some of the portfolios. They often come to us for lines of credit, et cetera. And I'm always impressed with not only the quality of the underwriting, but the oversight, the people they put on their boards. They're and Ron's right. Like, listen, I ran an alternate lender once upon a time, and very proud of that heritage. And the monolines are well-run businesses. They are as well-run and underwrite as well as anybody else, best in class. I think we have across the board. And the other thing we have to pay tribute to Ron, who's supposed to be like willing to tell truth to power and take people on in social media. I hear all these stories. He's a restrained, reasonable Ron is not something I'm used to. I'm disappointed for your listeners. The reality is Ron took on one of the biggest frauds that was going to happen in Ontario and kept screaming about it. And for his efforts, he was rewarded with a threatened lawsuit. But, we need more people like Ron to tell it as it is out there, particularly on social media. So he should be celebrated. I mean, he's a failed insurance guy that had to move to mortgages because he couldn't cut it.
I couldn't sell insurance. I had to start selling money. It turned out to be easier. The reality that these companies are well run, but the reality of the marketplace, and there's not going to be a problem at those companies, but the tragedy of someone going from 299 to 709 is real. It's a small number, but it's real. And one of the effects.
Is there anything the government could do? Like, Ron, I mean, affordability is the issue for governments right now.
Should be.
And they know that they have to respond to it in some way. If you have had your mortgage go up significantly, that's going to be one of the biggest cash pressures on you. Is there anything the government can do about that? Do you lengthen amortization rates or amortization times, or what can you do to help people muddle through something like this?
Well, there's really no escape. As John pointed out, the delta between the two products has shrunk to very little after today's increase. So if you want to get out of variable, you don't have any great options to do that today. Can government take steps? Sure. But I feel relatively certain that the government is going to step back and watch the effect of the Bank of Canada, no different than Britain's new prime minister saying she doesn't want to get involved in anything to do with housing. She's going to let the Bank of England take care of it. That was Liz Truss's view of it the other day. I think we'll see something similar in Canada. We'll see the government step back, observe, let the Bank of Canada go through its paces. Things will change. And then there will be an opportunity to try to address affordability in some way when this whole process of fighting inflation has finally come through its cycle.
Ron, they're going to end up cutting everybody a check just because politics demands that they do something to address affordability. So they're going to end up cutting everybody a check. And I'm trying to figure out if there's a smarter thing to do than just cut everybody a check.
Well, yeah, they did love the stimmy in the U.S., that's for sure. The stimmy was a great thing. People thought it was the best move of all. They might end up cutting people a check, but the reality of life is that if you don't take the kinds of action that John and I have suggested that address the supply issue, address some of the NIMBYism, address some of these odd processes of low property tax and sky high fees to build a property, if you never address those issues in this country, in the major cities where all these new Canadians are coming to, then you're going to keep having this problem. It's going to quiet down with the Bank of Canada increases, and then it's going to just keep on coming. There has to be an intelligent approach taken to deal with these issues by government. And the truth is, I think it puts the current government in a vulnerable spot. You talk about it all the time on Curse of Politics. The fact that it's almost ignored continues to put them into a dangerous place.
John, the housing market for individuals right now is, well, let me just take a step back. Ron is arguing, what I'm hearing from you guys is the big takeaway from this conversation is two things. One of which is housing affordability is a crisis and it's not going anywhere. The second big takeaway from this is that the current interest rate increases do not constitute a crisis of affordability for people. Am I getting that right? So the first problem needs a serious focus by government. The second thing, the current interest rate increases are probably manageable and fine and not going to create a default crisis or a people walking away from their homes thing, anything like that?
Well, it's not a credit crisis, but I don't think Ron and I said it's not an affordability crisis. I think rising interest rates are a challenge to borrowers. I think you have that right. I think that, Ron makes that point, and it's an important one, that we have low property taxes, low mill rates for existing homeowners, and then we whack new developers for building the new units, which adds enormously the cost of new dwellings. And those are the things that are counterintuitive and need to be addressed. The affordability thing isn't going to go away, Dave, because of the levels of immigration and millennials that want to buy a house. There's going to be demand. There's going to be demand over the next 10 years, and that's going to continue. The challenge we have is how many units can we put up and where and how quickly. And that's not something that's easy to solve. Even if we had all of the political will and all the governments, they're not going to abracadabra make all these units appear. But we have to work at it. And it's been neglected for many, many years, for decades, as Ron pointed out.
Tons of neglect. Now, so John's quite right. There's no banking crisis coming. Absolutely not. That's not the scenario that's going to take place. But is a home affordability a relentless kind of pain and frustration amongst millennials and others? Yeah, absolutely. And I suspect there'll be a political price paid for it.
So is your advice to a young person now who would like to buy a home that despite how difficult it is, now is still the best time to do it because prices are only going to go up, affordability is going to get worse, there's no point in waiting, like you jump now if you can?
Well, your home's an investment, but it's your home, right? You're not just buying an asset, you're buying somewhere that you want to live and raise your family. And and it's an emotional decision as well as financial. So you have to take all that into consideration. It depends very much on the circumstances of that prospective borrower. You can't.
But you guys only see this getting worse. That's what I'm saying, John. Right? You're only seeing this getting worse.
We see it continuing to be challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be challenging. Interest rates will continue upwards, not necessarily fixed, although there probably will still be some bumps in fixed rates. Variable will continue to climb. We're going to see just about every mortgage rate in Canada eventually, by the end of the year or beginning of next year, have a 5 in front of it. So if there's a 5 in front of most rates, that's a big shock to people who've been buying homes over the last 10 years. It's quite a big shock.
Right. You won't see as much refinancing either, David, right? Because people won't be trying to tap that equity in their home when rates are that high. And so they'll be, regulators will be pleased about that. They were concerned about using your house as a piggy bank and don't think there's any evidence of that. And then the market, the climate with rising interest rates and the threat of inflation peaking, but yet still, is there a recession? Is it a soft landing? That'll dampen down all of the housing ardor in the short term. But we're not talking about a quarter, another quarter. Looking out to 23 and beyond, would the best advice to be to someone, there isn't a bad time to get into the housing market? No, you can't make that absolute statement. But depending on your circumstances and what you need a financial plan. You need to know what your goals are and what you want to do. But if you looked at the data since it's been measured, you're better off if you bought a home than you did. That's a fact.
That's the historic truth of Canada. Yes, absolutely. My point is simple. We can't keep pushing these problems down the road, in spite of complexity, in spite of the seeming hopelessness of trying to deal with it. You have to address it. You can't have the federal government say that they're going to make major changes and then nothing happen. You can't have Doug Ford approached with the idea that we should try to end this blind bidding in the real estate. And Doug Ford says, nah, I think it's fine. Let's just leave it. You have to take some action. And the truth is, we've seen very little action in the last 5 years in the face of vast increases in home prices.
Okay, I got a controversial thing in my head, and you may not want to respond to it, but the government that seems most in charge of solving these problems seems to be the municipal level of government, and a lot of it's zoning, etc. The development business is very, very influential with municipal governments generally. So I would assume municipal governments are doing what developers want. So why don't we have more homes?
Well, municipal governments are also doing what local people in the neighborhoods want, hence massive NIMBYism. I mean, that's how you get elected as a councillor. You get elected by pleasing a tiny minority of people that are John's and yours and my age who are living in those houses for a long time. We're the voters in municipal elections. And the reality is we get lousy results from only paying attention to people who are in the process of signing up for their pension programs. Okay, I mean, you get that letter. John, you probably got that letter, right, from Service Canada that you got to sign up for the pension. All right, I know I got it. I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I got that goddamn letter. Okay, that happened. So, but we're the people who vote municipal elections. We're the people who set the tone, and it's a crappy tone. And that's why the feds and the province have to force some changes on these municipalities. You can't be fighting just putting up a duplex in Moore Park for the rest of time. I mean, you just can't do it. You've got to take the bull by the horns and do something good for new people coming into the community, which is not happening now.
David, you should know as a failed lawyer that
I'm a never tried lawyer. I would have failed almost certainly, but I never tried.
Municipalities are completely a creature of provincial statute. So the real catalyst for change has to come from the provinces on land use planning and making municipalities change the rules. And I think there has been an awakening to that. The difficulty is it's all about money, and they want the feds to transfer money. So, government needs to address this, because I'm not convinced that voters won't become galvanized around the affordability issue. And I think that'd be a good thing, that it becomes part of that electoral set that you make your ballot decision around. It might force some change. And I'm hopeful. I still believe in the political process. I don't live south of the border. And so I think that there is change possible by having those groups that are affected, by bringing that and asking for that political voice to be heard and then to be action. And that needs to happen. Ron is telling you exactly how it is, but it's been like that for too long. It can't continue. So if you want to complain about affordability, what are you, David Herle, doing about it?
All right, at the moment, nothing. But at the moment, nothing. But, John, when I was at your induction I want you to get a little philosophical here for a second. When I was at your induction into the Mortgage Hall of Fame.
Shortly after the longest speech in the history of the Hall of Fame for our friend Jerry, but go ahead.
Oh, my God, that was so painful.
Things didn't end that well for him after that speech.
Took a turn. It took a turn, yeah.
You spoke very movingly that night about the importance of home ownership to people and what it meant to people to own a home and what an important transaction that was in their life and all that. I've got to believe that if we end up with a generation of people that are not homeowners, or several generations of people that could not afford to enter the home market, we're going to end up with a less stable society.
Yeah, I don't think it's as extreme as that, because the new Canadians are going to continue to purchase and expand home ownership. And there will be people that view themselves as divided between losers and winners, those that can ultimately buy a home and those who can't. But I'm not quite that negative about it to say that they are being disenfranchised. I think, as I mentioned, David, the first-time buyers program is one of the best in the world, 5% down. It's taken some beatings. All they need to do right now, as a practical measure, is raise that $1 million cap in the urban markets, and we'll see more first-time buyers that are eligible again. So there are tweaks. You could extend AMS, as you said. I think if you talk to Andy or Stuart, any of the mortgage default insurers, they tell you they'd like to see those amortization extended, and it wouldn't have a credit impact, right? The politics of that have all been discussed but never publicly debated. And I think the public would be in favor of that. And as I said, the financial performance of those programs has been exemplary. So I think there are more things that we can do right than the things that we're doing wrong to improve the situation on affordability. You're right, but at the bottom of all this thing, it's macroeconomics that are going to drive it all. So if you've got a job and your income gets better every year and there are opportunities for promotion and wealth is being created and money's being reinvested, there will be a very content group of homeowners. But those are all related factors and they need to be in play, and they have been in play. That's why the expansion of mortgage credit in the housing market has been so robust up until recently, where we now have movement, where interest rates have moved upward, will continue to move upward for the next several months, and that will continue to dampen down the demand. But that demand is still going to overwhelm us. I think that's Ron and my point. Yeah. And, you know, the reality is that I believe because affordability about housing has never been one of the top three political issues, and now it may become that, I think that will add to the transparency, the public debate. We'll talk about that in the way that you and I used to talk about childcare, all of those other major issues that have been abandoned and then brought back to life, right? And been proven in many examples that they were necessary, but we needed them 25 years ago as well. It just took us that long. I think housing affordability will be like that, I hope, in Canada.
But we can't do nothing. We have to take action on the provincial level, as John's correct. Only the province can crack the whip on the municipalities because they're never going to change on their own. That's just the truth. There has to be change. And between province and feds holding back monies to try to encourage it, something's got to happen. We've got to rethink some things that have gone astray. You know, when I first bought a house, I think the average cost to the developer for a lot in Mississauga was around $38,000. So how the hell did we get to 180? The question has to be asked. It wasn't that long ago. It wasn't the Stone Age that I bought. So I'm saying that, well, it might have been Bronze Age. Bottom line
it's probably a painless way for a municipality to raise cash because there's no complainant.
Exactly. And it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. We have to consider things that have occurred in the last 30 years that have worked against the first-time buyer. John's right. The CMHC program and the other private insurers that John mentioned, as much as in the Twitterverse, there's a hatred for these low down payment programs. The fact is, and I champion it all the time, that it has never not worked. The CMHC program has paid the government of Canada money. It's only paid. Every time people talk about CMHC and these first-time buyer programs, oh, well, there's going to be a great debacle and the taxpayer's going to have to bail them out. There's going to be no goddamn bailout. And as time goes by, the CMHC is going to continue to deliver money to the taxpayer. It's the opposite of what most people think. And John is dead right on that score. We got to realize we have absolutely the best program. Like Fannie Mae went broke effectively, and CMHC sure as hell is never going to go broke. So we have to respect programs that really work. But until we start to address some of these costs that have been built in to new homes and address the fact that people who are coming here want a particular product that is not a 438 square foot condo, until we start to address these things intelligently, it's going to just get people madder and madder. And I hope, to your point, David, that politicians will realize, hell, this is a real thing. This can cost me an election.
I want to return to a more upbeat note, David, that you mentioned, because I think even if you're, been in the long in the tooth in the industry and becoming very cynical, that people will tell you in the mortgage business, you are helping folks. And it is such an important decision for them when they can get into the housing market and they buy their first home, and then that allows them the platform to do a step up, and it's a family experience. And I think that if you talk to the people that work like Ron and with the people that provide the underwriting, they do get jazzed up, because I've never seen people more grateful than if you can assist them through the home buying journey. I mean, I'm always amazed, frankly, about very sophisticated, successful business people that will change their impression of us as a lender because they had a positive experience, whether that's with Ron and Scotia Mortgage Authority or whether it's with Kevin and the home financing advisors, or whether it's walking into a retail branch. The people want to get comfort in that advice, because usually you're buying with a spouse or a family member and it's emotionally charged, and you need someone to rabbi you through the process. And if you do that and do that successfully, people are very grateful, and there is a genuine, warm, and encouraging response. And I think that's what keeps people in the game. I really do. I still believe that what I said, whatever that was 13, 14 years ago, and it's so kind of you to finally say that I spoke well. I've been waiting for that compliment forever. But it's true. It keeps me coming back. I think it's a great industry. I think Ron would agree with me. He chose this industry.
Yeah, it's true. The truth is, when I tell this to my family, if I won the lotto tomorrow, we'd just keep the brokerage going till all the money was gone.
That's an old Saskatchewan farm joke. You're recycling an old Saskatchewan farm joke.
Into the mortgage business. Yeah, that's
right. How do you make $1 million? How do you have $1 million farming? You start with $2 million. That was the old joke. All right, guys. Ron, I want free advice for my listeners. The kind of quality advice you give your own customers, fixed or variable right now.
You have to go fixed, and you should probably go short term. You should probably take a 2-year because there will be some rebalancing of rates at some point in the future. They're not going back to 2.5%. They're not going back to 2%. They're not going back to 1.5%. But you may have a shot at a lower. We had a brief moment in time a month ago when some types of mortgage rates and 5-year mortgage rates went down to about 4.25. So to jump into 5.5 today 5.25 today might not be your best bet. So keep your options open on fixed rate, but variable, it's going to keep going up. And I'm not sure, just from a psychological point of view, people have the stomach for that, because we're getting calls. We get calls every day. I know John's call centers get calls every single day. What the hell? It's just went up so much. And that's hard for people to stomach, and therefore short-term fixed rate might be the answer today.
All right. Thanks, guys, for this conversation this afternoon. I've had a lot of fun with you. John, I love you. Ron, thanks for
it's a double honor for me. It's just a double honor for me because I've now been on the same show as John Webster and Axelrod, and I'm not sure who's quite in the category of the top dog there, but it's a real honor. Thank you.
Well, I'll take John Webster anytime. All right. I'd like to thank everybody who listened or watched today. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN, Rail, and Google, and John and Ron. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week,
David.
people, with more Herle Burly.
Thanks for having us, David.